September 11, 2001. On that date, the United States was attacked by Al-Qaeda, a splinter group of ruthless militant Muslims. The lives of almost 3,000 people were taken that day. That attack was followed by other attacks in Bali, Indonesia, Madrid, and London. Hundreds of additional lives were lost. The United States responded by working to ferret out Al-Qaeda cells and by attacking Afghanistan and overthrowing its regime that had been harboring Al-Qaeda. Then the United States attacked Iraq and overthrew the brutal regime of Saddam Hussein. The fighting, destruction, and deaths continue today.
Our nation's ongoing long-term struggle against the violent Islamist movement raises many questions for the thoughtful Christian. First, we need to understand why, whenever we think things have gotten better and we are looking forward to an era of peace, violence and war break out all over again.
The people in the Old Testament knew what the psalmist was talking about when he talked about the terror by night and the arrow that flies at noonday. Terror and war are very difficult realities, and they're a part of our sinful world, and we have to struggle with how we can best respond to the facts of violence and war and terrorism in the world.
Truly, war and terrorism are a part of our broken, sinful world. But what does this mean as our nation faces the challenges of terrorists bent on our destruction? Does this mean our government should itself resort to war and the killing that goes with war?
God calls governments to do justice. Romans 13 doesn't just tell us we should obey government and whatever it does, but it says that it's the task of government to punish those who do evil and to reward those who do good. And terrorists are certainly evildoers, and so I believe that governments have a very clear obligation to protect us against terrorism, but they need to do so in such a way that at the same time they're not being destroyed by the enemy within, by a spirit of vengeance, by being so overtaken with fear that we end up doing unjust things ourselves.
It does present some challenge in that when I listen to Christ's call to love my enemy, to pray for my enemy, to turn the other cheek, it's tough when you're dealing with a radicalized group that is, say, suicidal, willing to die for their beliefs. It's very difficult then to say, I'm going to turn the other cheek when they're getting onto a bus full of people and blowing up innocents. So it does present some challenges as a Christian to find the proper use of force. Some force may be necessary. Some hard lines may need to be drawn in the sand. And yet the slippery slope then is that that the pendulum swings too far, that we pursue our objectives at all costs.
The idea that we should do whatever it takes always makes me nervous. Somewhere there has to be the kind of love that doesn't let us be treated poorly, but also treats that person with respect because of who they are as a creation of God and not what they've done.
Even Christians who insist that the God-given, justice-pursuing role of government allows for governments to use force to protect their citizens and thwart the efforts of those who are plotting evil, also insist with equal strength that governments in the use of deadly force must observe certain limits. An anything-goes attitude is not right. Down through the centuries, Christians have struggled with the question of what limits should a justice-promoting government observe as it uses even deadly force and warfare in its pursuit of justice. We today, as followers of Jesus Christ, need to struggle with that question as we respond to the horror of 9/11 and the terrorists who would do us great harm. That question is not easy to answer can be seen in some remarks President Bush made immediately after 9/11.
On September 14, 2001, President Bush spoke to a mourning nation from the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. In that address, he proclaimed, "Our responsibility to history is already clear, to answer these attacks and rid the world of evil." 6 days later, he addressed a joint session of Congress and declared, "Our war on terror begins with al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated."
President Bush, with these words, promised to rid the world of evil and to find, stop, and defeat every terrorist group of global reach. We need to ask ourselves, are these appropriate, realistic goals? Do they observe the sort of limits that biblical principles suggest we ought to impose on ourselves?
For those of us who are not pacifists, who believe that there are times when a nation has to go to war against another nation in order to do justice, to correct really horrible things. Obviously, the war against the Nazis was a clear case in point for this. But for a Christian, it's so important for us to think about the spirituality of warfare. St. Augustine, who introduced the just war guidelines for nations, said at one point that as we go about trying to destroy our enemies, we have to be very careful not to ourselves be destroyed by the enemy within. And then he said something amazing. He said, it's so important that even warfare be conducted with kindness. Now, that's a puzzling thing. But I think what St. Augustine was saying was that if we see even our enemy, our worst enemy, the Saddam Husseins and the Hitlers, as also created in the image of God, that we may very well have to do very harsh things to correct their behavior and maybe even to bring them to death. But that we ought never to do it with a spirit of vengeance, with a cruel attitude that could itself destroy us within. And so there's a spirituality of dealing with terrorism and with warfare that's a very important part of the Christian life and often gets ignored by biblical Christians.
Yeah, I think for me this is probably the most complex, or one of the more complicated questions.
Government's always about, at some point, the use of violence or the use of force. And if we believe the government is ordained by God for particular reasons, then we have to start thinking about under which circumstances ought we to use violence. You know, what is important enough, or at what point are we obligated to kill, or are we ever?
But you know, for the Christian, being destroyed by terrorists is not the worst thing in the world. The worst thing in the world is what the Apostle Paul talks about in that wonderful passage in the Epistle to the Romans, where he says that the real threat is to be separated from the love of God in Jesus Christ. And so we have a very special obligation as people who do not consider the threat of terrorism to be the worst thing in the world. We have a very special obligation to remind our government that it's quite possible for a government in legitimately protecting citizens against terrorism to do things itself that can destroy our souls. And that's a very important thing for us to be talking about today, that we cannot be carried away by anger, by a spirit of vengeance, by winning at any cost. And we have a special obligation to tell the world that terrorism isn't the biggest threat. What's the biggest threat is that we be separated from the love of God in Jesus Christ.
So I don't know how you balance those two things, though. You know, separation from God, not death, is the only thing we ought to fear. Then terrorism really isn't, a problem to us in the long run, but definitely in the short run, while we're living here, we need to deal with it.
Well, I think he's provided an important caution, right? We can't let vengeance govern our policies. We can't strike out in anger. we need to be very careful about how we deal with this.
There are some times, I think, where it's okay for a Christian or a just society to kill or even wage war to prevent worse outcomes from happening. And that's not just a let's let the ends justify the means approach. There are definitely limits. There are things that we must not do under any circumstances. But this is a fallen world, and I feel that that my faith allows room to do what we have to within certain limitations to rescue the innocent.